New Thought Media Network. We are a global broadcast network of positive music, media, and entertainment, inspiring humanity's evolution along the journey of enlightenment and creating a world of love, peace, empowerment, and prosperity for all. New Thought Media Network. Positively inspiring.
New Thought Media Network is proud to present New Thought's Roots and Branches with Reverend Dr. Ruth Miller. Join us every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Mountain Time. Tune in live or watch anytime on our YouTube channel. Discover the rich history of New Thought and its impact on modern spirituality. Join Reverend Dr. Ruth Miller as she shares insights, stories, and teachings that inspire and uplift. Experience deep insights and transformative teachings that connect you to the roots of New Thought. Visit our YouTube channel to catch up on past episodes and join us live every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Connect with us and be part of the journey.
Well, hello there. I am Ruth Miller, and this is New Thought Roots and Branches. Over the last several weeks, we've been looking at the folks who were very, very, very powerful in the 19th century, and we've begun to look at the folks who have been important to us in the 20th century, and fairly soon we'll start talking about the 21st. But we've got a few people to cover first. Among others, we've had the basic foundation teachers. Now we're going to find the people who have actually help everyone in the world understand these concepts. And we're going to start with Florence Scovel Shinn. Now, you may or may not recognize the name Shinn, but you probably know the book, The Game of Life and How to Play It, which was her amazing piece of work that came out of a very interesting life. If we look at our map of New Thought people over the years, you can see she's down there near the bottom, because that's what we're talking about in the 20th century. We got centuries and centuries of stuff beforehand that is leading up to these understandings today. If we look at the next slide, we will see she's not even on the chart. Because she's not in any of these lineages as the person who put together this chart understands them to be. However, she worked very closely with both Emily Cady and Emma Curtis Hopkins in New York as she was going through her process. If we look at the next slide, we can get a glimpse of who and what this amazing woman really was. She was an actress. Her husband wrote plays for her, and she was an illustrator, an award-winning illustrator. And so these are the two classic images of Florence Scovel Shinn. In the next slide, we'll start seeing a little bit about her growing up. She was an East Coaster. So far, the only West Coaster we've had is Melinda Kramer. And then we have the Fenwick and Ernest Holmes brothers going over to the West Coast, but we're still in the East Coast with Florence Scovel. Florence Scovel was born in New Jersey in 1871. So she's one of that post-Civil War generation of folks who did not have that in their personal experience. However, she grew up in a family where it was very, very well known that her great-great-grandfather, Francis Hopkinson, was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And he was also a songwriter. He's the first official American songwriter. So she comes from an old family that is well recognized. Her family supported her in going to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, where she met Everett Shinn, who is considerably younger, actually, but who was, he was everything she wanted in a man at the time, and he won her heart. We go into the next slide, we find out that having graduated from this Academy of the Arts, she became a professional artist. She illustrated books and magazines, and she sold paintings and sketches starting 1896. So at the age of 25, she was a recognized professional artist. And she was part of what's called the Trash Can School, which centered in Greenwich Village, where they were living. And it's a group of artists who were rebelling against the Hudson School, which were these marvelous classic portraits of seascapes and landscapes with lots of detail and beautiful color, mostly in oil. But they were going, no, we're not doing it that way. Also, they were rebelling against the classic ideas. And you can see in this sketch that there was a bit of a very modern touch in this pre-20th century sketch. They would meet in each other's homes, they would share a meal, and then they would debate about different styles, and they would compare them. And they had a marvelous time being very, very, very bohemian at the end of the 19th century. If we look at the next slide, we find that that time was the time that she was living in Greenwich Village in a studio apartment. Look at this. We even have the address in New York City. If you've been near Washington Square Park, you might even have seen where Waverly Place steps off of Fifth Avenue. And her husband built a theater next door. So they rented an apartment, and then he converted the building next door into a theater. He wrote plays, 3 of them, having Florence as the star. Now that's an admirer, wouldn't you say? They earned enough money that they could spend their summers up in New Hampshire in a house that her husband built at the Cornish Art Colony in Plainfield, New Hampshire. So, and if you have ever been in New York City in the hot summer days, you understand why they went up into the hills of New Hampshire whenever they could during the summer. But he designed and built the house. Of course, they had contractors doing most of the work. So they were living quite well during those first 10 years of the 20th century. They were in the high life in the whole area of city of New York, in Plainfield, New Hampshire, in the art colonies, and in the Greenwich Village. The village life included Mr. and Mrs. Shinn. However, as often happens, as we look at the next slide, things begin to shift and change. So she was working as an illustrator. Her illustrations were showing up in all these magazines and in these books. She was elected into the association of the Society of Illustrators. I love this particular one. If you can't read the caption, it says, the Universalists, the Unitarians have such nice children's parties, the Unitarians. So one of the stories that she was illustrating was about a young girl who had moved into a new area and met with the Unitarians and was enjoying the party. In the next slide, we see some more of her illustrations. We see a magazine cover. In some ways, she was the Norman Rockwell of her day because she always had that little bit of twist of humor. And her illustrations were incredibly detailed and relatable, right? Marvelous things. And that world was her world as she went through that first decade of the 20th century. And then in 1912, in the next slide, we see the children having to take medicine. And well, I think the reason that was what she called happy days, this was the year that her husband divorced her. I don't know exactly why he did. I haven't been able to find any information on that. But in 1912, well, you know, she's not a young chick anymore, and there's lots of young actresses around. I have a feeling she hit 40 and he walked out the door, as has happened with far too many women in our culture, unfortunately. However, she kept the apartment in Greenwich Village. So she remained a major part of Greenwich Village life, even without her husband. And even though she had to try to support herself completely on her own from then on. And mostly it was with her drawings. However, it wasn't sufficient. If we look at the next slide, we get a sense of how Florence looked at this point in her life. The end, just that beginning, right prior to the 1920s, before World War I, when she is still a relatively young woman, but no longer the glamour girl of the 1890s. In the next slide, we get to see what she started to do. Without a husband in 1912 in New York City, not being a widow, but being divorced, must have been very hard, very harder on her indeed. So she wandered around looking for answers, and she found a group of women who were empowering and empowered themselves, including Emily Cady, the holistic physician, who had been in New York at that point about 40 years. Actually, Emily was starting to practice the year that Florence Scovel was born, which tells you a little bit about the difference in their ages. And then Emma Curtis Hopkins was a regular speaker at the Unity Truth Center in New York because Emma spent her winters in New York. So we have a lot of contact with these very powerful women. And Florence trained as a practitioner and began to earn an income as a practitioner, which was very much in alignment with what Emma was teaching and trying to make happen. You may recall that Emma was in the women's pavilion at the Chicago World's Fair with a display on how women could become independent financially through becoming practitioners of this healing process that is the essence of New Thought. And as she must inevitably do, Florence began to start teaching other people, and then to, in the process, coalesce her ideas and be able to put together a series of anecdotes and principles. She began to see clients not only at the center, but at home, and often as she went forward in time on the telephone. Yep, telephones were being introduced into New York while Florence was studying and becoming a New Thought practitioner, and she began to see huge results. In the next slide, I took an extract from one of her books that we can see her results from one of them. A woman I know had for years an appearance of a terrible skin disease. The doctors told her it was incurable, and she was in despair. She was on the stage, and she found she would soon have to give up her profession, and she had no other means of support. So on the stage, right, this is the world that Everett and Florence were living in. In this text, Florence tells us she, however, procured a good engagement, and on the opening night made a great hit. She received flattering notices from the critics and was joyful and elated. The next day, she received a notice of dismissal. A man in the cast had been jealous of her success and had caused her to be sent away. She felt hatred and resentment taking complete possession of her. And she cried out, "Oh God, don't let me hate that man." That night, she worked for hours in the silence. Now, I've suggested that maybe this is a friend, but I have a feeling it might be autobiographical. She worked for hours in the silence. So she was using the methods that Emily Cady and Emma Hopkins were teaching her to undo her upset over this man having her dismissed after a big hit in her performance, a performance that was a big hit. All right, so in the next paragraph, she said, "I soon came into a very deep silence. I seemed to be at peace with myself, with the man, and with the whole world." Pay attention to that. I seemed to be at peace with myself, with the man, and with the whole world. Continuing, she said, "I continued this for 2 following nights. And on the third day, I found I was healed completely of the skin disease. In asking for love or goodwill, this woman had fulfilled the law, all right? Choosing love, choosing the quality of the divine that we call love, or choosing to be in total union with the divine in that state of being we call love, her physical condition was healed. This is so integral to the whole New Thought movement. And I think it was one of the turnarounds in Florence's life and teachings. She says, love is the fulfilling of the law, which is a quote from the New Testament, and the disease, which came from subconscious resentment, she says, was wiped out. So many people are wandering around on this planet with conditions that doctors have told them they can't do anything about, when in fact they are based in issues in consciousness, in their states of mind. And Florence knew this, and she wanted to do something about it. So in the next slide, we see that she began to expand her ministry beyond the students that she was teaching in the center and beyond the people that she could treat in her home, on the phone, and in the center. And she wrote the book, The Game of Life and How to Play It, in 1925, 13 years after the divorce, after a number of years of learning and practicing and teaching these methods. What's cool from those of us, especially for those of us who have been involved in writing books, she self-published this book in 1925. It has never been out of print since. There have been many, many editions published by many, many other people. And every time people get in touch with it, especially when it's just exactly that right point in their lives where they open it and go, oh, wow, right? I have several students, and one in particular whose daughter picked up the book and said, I have to learn all about this, because she had been making a joke about how her life might be in her final days that was not at all what she intended or wanted it to be. And Florence is quite clear. That part of us that brings forth our experience does not have a sense of humor. So she went on with that book. That book became a bestseller. She offered it to all of her students and clients. It had great reviews, and it went on and on and on. And then she wrote a number of follow-up books. And then it turned out that just a few years ago, like 15 years ago, a secondhand dealer in New York City found an old handwritten manuscript that was signed by Florence. He sent that to Louise Hay, and Hay House published it in 2013. And if we look at the next slide, the book that Hay House published is the rainbow-colored book, The Magic of Your Intuition. So The Game of Life and How to Play It is the one everyone knows, but people may not know about The Secret Door of Success, Your Word is Your Wand, The Power of the Spoken Word, or the fact that she's been translated into many, many, many languages, which is what the blue cover does. And then there is this new book. So if you're hungry for Florence, find this new book, because nobody's seen it before the last decade or so. As we go on in our next slide, we get to see how Emmett Fox, who we've talked about, no, we haven't talked about on this show, we will be talking about more and more, described Florence's work. He says, one secret of Shinn's success was that she was always herself, colloquial, informal, friendly, and humorous. She never sought to be literary, conventional, or impressive. For this reason, she appealed to thousands who would not have taken the spiritual the spiritual message through more conservative and dignified forms, or have been willing to read, at least in the beginning, the standard metaphysical books. She is a door opener. She is a gateway. The Game of Life and How to Play It has transformed many, many lives and has led many people to learn more about this movement that we call New Thought. So what was she teaching? In the next several slides, we'll look at some of the quotes that come from some of her books. The first one is from the very first pages of her first book. The game of life is a game of boomerangs. Our thoughts, deeds, and words return to us sooner or later with astounding accuracy. And the second point, as I mentioned earlier, the subconscious mind has no sense of humor, and people often joke themselves into unhappy experiences. And joking can be, quote, teasing. It can be being satirical. It can be being cynical. It can be doing any number of things that you think you don't really mean, but the body mind or the brain body accepts as, oh, this is what's wanted here. So it then moves in that direction. The third point, whatever, and I will point this out, she grew up in the 19th century and was writing prior to World War II. So all of her books are what we would call sexist. They are gender biased, where the word man refers to every human being on the planet, man, woman, child, right? And so we'll see this over and over again in her writings. If this bothers you, you might take a look at my version of her book, which is called The New Game of Life and How to Play It, where I've removed this gender bias, and I've also added a few exercises and summaries and things that might be useful. All right, she says, whatever man feels deeply or images clearly, and you can use the word imagines if you like, images clearly, is impressed upon the subconscious mind and carried out in minutest detail. Now, that phrase, subconscious mind, you may recall that when we're talking about Thomas Troward, he was saying that that part of us that brings forth our experience is not our usual thought process. It's not our normal consciousness. And he called it the subconscious mind. In modern parlance, we might call it the unconscious mind or the field of mind in which our consciousness, our normal thinking process, is embedded. But right now, Florence was using at that time the term subconscious mind for the fullness of us that has been reaching out over space and time without being limited by 3 dimensions or a body. Finally, this last line, continually making believe, impresses the subconscious. That is, the process of making believe, that is, of imagining how it is and feeling it and acting in it, is how we set up the body-mind system to experience what it is we are ready to experience. In the next slide, we're going to do a few more of these concepts. She says, there is an old saying that man only dares use his words for 3 purposes: to heal, bless, or prosper. The second point kind of explains this. What man says of others will be said of him, and what he wishes for another, he is wishing for himself. Because this mind aspect of us that she's calling the subconscious does not know and does not experience any separation. So when, and I am guilty of this, I get upset with people periodically and I start saying, so-and-so is doing this or being this. And I go, oops, whoops. It's not the so-and-so. It's my own other self that is doing this. It is me. And when I am upset and I declare that, I'm literally impressing on my own being that I do this. So we need to not do that anymore. As she says in the third point, what man condemns in others, he attracts to himself. And then we can only receive, man can only receive what he sees himself receiving. But that includes seeing other people receiving, because it's all oneself. Excuse me. Got a little something in the throat there. So in the next slide, we look at this idea of shifting dimensions. It's a huge idea. It's not built into many New Thought concepts or approaches. And it's in her later books. It's not in the Game of Life book. She says you must form the habit of living in what she's calling the fourth dimension, the world of the wondrous. It is the world where you do not judge by appearances. She's saying we must form the habit of being the self that is not limited by space and time, being in this unlimited space where we can reach across space and time and where everything that we have ever longed for already exists. This goes back to Plato. This is why we're called Neoplatonists, because Plato tells us that there is this dimension, this realm of being in which everything we wish already exists. The ideal already exists. And all we have to do is bring that into form through the power of our thought. Okay? And then she says, there is no there, anywhere across space and time or across dimensions. There is only here. Nothing exists outside of this present moment. Nothing can be experienced outside of this present moment. She's living this, and she explains many times that our memories are not real anymore, and our visions of the future are moving in the direction of reality. And now, and what we are feeling now is all that matters. So that gets us into the next slide, where she has some suggested affirmations. Start your day with an affirmation, she says. And this is her standard affirmation. I have a friend who, when I was early on in these studies and I was feeling frustrated, she wrote this down on a piece of paper, and for years I carried it in my suitcase. Today is a day of completion. I give thanks for this perfect day. Miracle shall follow miracle, and wonders shall never cease. This is what she recommended everyone to repeat several times every morning. And she says, make this a habit, and one will see wonders and miracles come into his life. Yes, anyone who is able to feel this and be open to this. Now, those of you who saw What the Bleep Do We Know may recall the very young Joe Dispenza sharing how he uses a phrase very much like this every day, and he adds one other little piece to it. He says, and make it a surprise so that I know it was not my intention or my normal thought processes or my doing anything that made it happen. So every day, being aware that the day is perfect. It already is. And that miracles are following every day. It's a series of miracles and wonders coming into our lives. And then she says, every now and then when stuff comes up, and this is from the Game of Life, she says, use casting the burden. Casting the burden. Whatever the issue is, it's a burden. We are being burdened by it. We are not being free. We are not being open. We're not being fully alive because of this resentment or anger or guilt or fear or frustration or disappointment. Any of those things are burdens. And she says we can cast the burden and go free. And as she puts it in this affirmation, I cast this burden of, put whatever word you want there, in this case, resentment, on the Christ within, and I go free. Now, the Christ within, this Christ is not a man in the Bible, okay? She's explained this out a little bit. This Christ within us is the embodiment of the power. It is our true self. It is the part of us that is always in unified state with the all that is, with the source of being, with the creator, with the creative process, right? All of that is who we are. So if I'm getting all flustered about something that's going on up here, I cast that to If I need to imagine it outside of me, go ahead, outside. But it is the essence of each of us that is being willing and able to take it on and transform it. And I go free to be loving, harmonious, and happy. Whatever we're doing, we are not stuck. Whatever we are experiencing, we are not stuck. And we are not subject to it when we know truth, when we feel our beingness outside of space and time, outside of this three-dimensional limitation that we call me, right? Oh no, this is not me. This is just the current manifestation of who I've been thinking, of what I've been thinking for some time. And so I cast the burden of any disappointment, any resentment, any frustration, any anxiety, anything on that power that is within me to transform it. And I go free. I go in my life, my love, my peace, my joy, the beauty, this heavenly world. And in these days, in this world that we have grown up in that is going through so many things, we all can afford to be casting this burden on a power that is so far greater than any of us have ever thought we could possibly be. And when we do that, then we can be free. And we don't have to be in the fear or the anger or the upset or the disappointment or the frustration or any of those other emotions that our culture encourages us to be living in. We don't have to do that. We can cast the burden. And we can know that each day is filled with miracles. And miracles in the New Thought tradition, as we have seen in the past, are not a breaking away from what can be, but are the realization of what truly is. So the miracles that follow are exactly the right thing showing up at exactly the right moment, correct? Exactly the right person showing up and saying precisely what we need to hear. The song coming on the radio the moment we happen to be thinking those thoughts. All of those things are miracles because that's how the universe actually works. We call them miracles because it's not how the culture taught us the universe works. But they're happening all the time. Most of the time, they're happening in a negative way. We've been thinking about bills. We've been thinking about jobs. We've been thinking about fights. We've been thinking about problems. And guess what? There are more of them. Sooner or later, you're going to get tired of hearing me say all of that. But right now, think of it in terms of you are declaring at the beginning of the day, as Florence says, that your life is filled with these wonderful miracles of delight. Wonders shall never cease, she says. And we enter a state of gratitude. Gratitude, because in gratitude, that channel to the infinite is open. And we can feel more and more of that power working in us and through us. In Joe Dispenza's research, and I really do know other scientists besides him, but he's the popular one people know about. But in his research, he found that 10 minutes a day of pure, unconditional gratitude increased people's immune system to the point where they were immune to virtually every microbe around them for 3 days. Just 10 minutes. Wow. And if we can do that more and more, right? So I give thanks and I go into that state of, oh yes, I give such thanks that this is a miraculous life. And everything that I could ever need or want is always supplied. And that's the essence of the game of life. Knowing that everything we could need or want is supplied now. Feeling the gratitude. And then she had one more point. She said, act as if. And there are a number of examples in the game of life in particular where she talks about how people acted as if so-and-so bought a magazine or a piece of furniture or a piece of jewelry or the right piece of clothing for this event that they were ready to experience to happen. They acquired it. They lived with the fact that they were going to be using it, and they imagined it, and they felt this deep gratitude that it is so. And it became their experience, often in a matter of days, and always in plenty of time, actually the nick of time, for whatever their concern was to be addressed. Yes. And if anything, any disappointment, frustration, or anxiety gets in the way, I cast the burden and I go free into my imagining of the reality, because my imagining is far closer to the true reality than anything else that the newspapers, the TV, the internet, or any other person is ever going to describe for me. Well, Florence lived a very full life. She was very well known. She was active all the way through her life in her New York community, and she began this huge correspondence and telephone correspondence with people all over the world well into her 70s. And we look at the last slide here, we can see that in October of 1940, Florence Scovel Shinn, Mrs. Florence Shinn, writer and lecturer, specialized in metaphysics, also known as an illustrator, had an obituary in the New York Times. And Mrs. Florence Scovel Shinn, illustrator, writer on metaphysics, and lecturer, died yesterday at her home. And we have the Fifth Avenue address because, well, she decided to move up in the world when she continued to be very popular in the world. Now, one of the questions that always comes up is, if these people know all of this, how come they died, right? Well, with Mrs. Shinn, the official story is there were a few days of illness. What did that mean? If you remember with Myrtle Fillmore, she started saying her goodbyes on a Wednesday, and she completed her goodbyes on a Thursday. And on Friday, she went out to the farm. She gathered apples. And at the end of the day, she went to bed, and she didn't get up again, and on Tuesday was declared dead. I'm guessing something like that happened with Florence as well, because we're looking at very, 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 very active, responding, doing all kinds of good things at their work and in her world, and then having a few days of illness, at the end of which she was gone. With Emma Curtis Hopkins, it was a little more dragged out, but not much. Charles, it was a very similar kind of thing. Charles Fillmore, when it was time, he was on his way to Unity Village. He was able to go to his home in Unity Village, be surrounded by the people who loved him, including his son. And his very last words, if you recall, were, "I see the New Jerusalem." Yes. So I think the time comes when we realize, even the most profound metaphysical teachers realize, we're done. We've done what we can do. It's time for a new generation, or everything that we can do or is appropriate for us to do is in print or has already been passed on to new generations, and we can go on. And what are we going on to? We're going on to total freedom, total love, total joy, total, fullness of being in an environment that is unconditional love. And there's a second part to that. In the world that we are raised in, we think that heaven is somewhere out there. And when we have, in order to be in that heavenly state, we have to leave this body. And all of the people we've talked about so far grew up in this culture, and all of them were deeply trained in that idea. So they believed that in order to be functioning in the heavenly world, they had to end their time in the body at some deep level. Charles, not so much. He was an immortalist. I think it really surprised him that he ended up doing this. But at a deeper level, he had already been trained to expect this. There are people all over the world in other spiritual traditions who have not gone through the death process. There are, a student of Dudjom Rinpoche told me about 150 of Dudjom's students who, when it was time, when they knew they were done on this planet, they sat down, they began to meditate. And as they closed down each of their body systems, they filled those parts of their body with light, filled and filled and filled with light until poof, all that's left was their hair and their fingernails and their clothing. 150. And Dudjom just died a few years ago. So we're talking very modern. There are other stories in other traditions. I'm just giving you that one. I think Shinn grew up in a world where she needed to be on the other side to experience heaven. But here's a piece. She knew we weren't just three-dimensional beings. And I believe, based on what I've read in her works, that she understood that a generation was coming where death would not be happening because we know we are multidimensional beings, and this body is the current manifestation of that beingness, for which I give Mrs. Shinn a great deal of credit and appreciation. She was an amazing contributor to the field, mostly by opening it up to thousands of people, millions of people actually, who have read her books, who would never, ever have thought that metaphysics was something they could be interested in. You can listen to people read her books on YouTube. You can order her books from many, many, many different sources. You'll probably find The Game of Life in a thrift store near you because many people have been reading it. And as they pass on and their children have become familiar with it, they put the books in the local thrift store. I greatly admire Florence Scovel Shinn. She took lemons, turned them into lemonade, and that lemonade ended up being something that we are all benefiting from, for which I think we can all be grateful. Thank you for joining me today on New Thought, Roots and Branches, where we are talking about each of these wonderful teachers. And as we're reminded in the final slide, we get to be exploring today the life of Florence Scovel Shinn as part of this marvelous movement. Next week, we'll look at another one of the early 20th century teachers. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.